An African Millionaire by Grant Allen. Number 1. The Episode of the Mexican Seer. My name is Seymour Wilbraham Wentworth. I'm brother-in-law to the secretary to Sir Charles Vandrift, the South African millionaire, and famous financier. Many years ago, when Charlie Vandrift was a small lawyer in Cape Town, I had the qualified good fortune to marry his sister. Much later, when the Vandrift estate and farm near Kimberley developed by degrees into a Cloaderterp Golcondas Limited, my brother-in-law offered me the not unremunerative post of secretary, in which capacity I have ever since been his constant and attached companion. He is not a man whom any common sharper can take in, is Charles Vandrift. Middle height, square build, firm mouth, keen eyes, the very picture of a sharp and successful business genius. I have only known one rogue impose upon Sir Charles, and that one rogue, as the commissary of police that's nice, remarked, would doubtless have imposed upon a syndicate of Vidocq, Robert Houdin, and Cagliostro. We had run across the Riviera for a few weeks in the season, our object being strictly rest and recreation from the arduous duties of a financial combination. We did not think it necessary to take our wives out with us. Indeed, Lady Vandrift is absolutely wedded to the joys of London, and does not appreciate the rural delights of the Mediterranean littoral. But Sir Charles and I, though immersed in affairs when at home, both thoroughly enjoy the complete change from the city to the charming vegetation and pellucid air of the terrace at Monte Carlo. We're so very fond of scenery. That delicious view over the rocks of Monaco, on with the maritime Alps in the air, and the blue sea in front, not to mention the imposing casino in the foreground, appeals to me as one of the most beautiful prospects in all of Europe. Sir Charles has a sentimental attachment to the place. He finds it restores and refreshes him after the turmoil in London, to win a few hundred at roulette in the course of the afternoon among the palms and cactuses and pure breezes of Monte Carlo. The country, say I, for the jaded intellect. However, we never on any account actually stop in the principality itself. Sir Charles thinks Monte Carlo is not a sound address for financiers' letters. He prefers a comfortable hotel on the Promenade d'Anglais at Nice, where he recovers health and renovates his nervous system by taking daily excursions along the coast to the casinos. This particular season we were snugly ensconced at the Hotel d'Anglais. We had capital quarters on the first floor, salon, study, and bedrooms, and found on the spot a most agreeable cosmopolitan society. All Nice, just then, was ringing with talk about a curious impostor, known to his followers as the Great Mexican Seer, and supposed to be gifted with second sight, as well as with endless other supernatural powers. Now, in this particularity of my able brother-in-law, that when he meets with a quack, he burns to expose him. He is so keen a man of business himself that it gives him, so to speak, a disinterested pleasure to unmask and detect impostures in others. Many ladies at the hotel, some of whom had met and conversed with the Mexican seer, were constantly telling us strange stories of his doings. He had disclosed to one the present whereabouts of a runaway husband. He had pointed out to another the numbers that would win at roulette the next evening. He had shown a third the image on a screen of a man she had for many years adored without his knowledge. course, Sir Charles didn't believe a word of it, but his curiosity was roused. He wished to see and judge for himself of the wonderful thought reader. What would be his terms, do you think, for a private seance? He asked of Madame Picaret, the lady to whom the seer had successfully predicted the winning numbers. He does not work for money, Madame Picaret answered, but for the good of humanity. I'm sure he would gladly come to an exhibit for nothing his miraculous facilities. Nonsense, Sir Charles answered. The man must live. I'd pay him 5 guineas, though, to see him alone. What hotel is he stopping at? The Cosmopolitan, I think, said the lady. Oh no, I remember now. The Westminster. Sir Charles turned to me quietly. Look here, Seymour, he whispered. Go around to this fellow's place immediately after dinner and offer him £5 to give a private seance at once in our rooms, without mentioning who I am to him. Keep the name quite quiet. Bring him back with you, too, and come straight upstairs with him, so that there may be no collusion. We'll see just how much this fellow can tell us. I went as directed. I found the seer a very remarkable and interesting person. He stood about Sir Charles's own height, but was slimmer and straighter, with an aquiline nose, strangely piercing eyes, very large black pupils, and a finely chiseled, close-shaven face like the bust of Antonius in our hall in Mayfair. What gave him his most characteristic touch, however, was his odd head of hair, curly and wavy like Paderewski's, standing out in a halo around his high white forehead and his delicate profile. I could see at a glance where he succeeded so well in impressing women. He had the look of a poet, a singer, and a prophet. I have come round, I said, to ask whether you will consent to give a seance at once in my friend's room, and my principal wishes me to add that he is prepared to pay £5 at the price of entertainment. Signor Antonio Herrera, that was what he called himself, bowed to me with an impressive Spanish politeness. His dusky olive cheeks were wrinkled with a smile of genteel contempt as he answered gravely, I do not sell my gifts. I bestow them freely. If your friend, your anonymous friend, desires to behold the cosmic wonders that are wrought through my hands, I am glad to show them to him. Fortunately, as often happens when it is necessary to convince and confound a skeptic, for that your friend is a skeptic I feel instinctively, I chance to have no engagements at all this evening. He ran his hand through his fine long hair reflectively. Yes, I go, he continued, as if addressing some unknown presence that hovered about the ceiling. I go. Come with me. Then he put on his broad sombrero, with its crimson ribbon wrapped a cloak around his shoulders, lighted a cigarette, and strode forth by my side towards the Hotel de l'Anglaise. He walked little by the way, and that little in curt sentences. He seemed buried in deep thought. Indeed, when we reached the door and I turned in, he stepped a step or two farther on, as if not noticing to the place I had brought him. Then he drew himself up short and gazed about him for a moment. Ah, the Anglaise, he said. And I may mention in passing that his English, in spite of a slight southern accent, was idiomatic and excellent. It is here, then. It is here. He was addressing once more the unseen presence. I smiled to think that these childish devices were intended to deceive Sir Charles Vandrift. Not quite the sort of man, as the city of London knows, to be taken in by hocus pocus. All of this I saw was the cheapest and most commonplace conjurer's patter. We went upstairs to our rooms. Charles had gathered together a few friends to watch the performance. The seer entered, wrapped in thought. He was in evening dress, but a red sash around his waist gave a touch of picturesqueness and a dash of color. He paused for a moment in the middle of the salon without letting his eyes rest on anybody or anything. Then he walked straight up to Charles and held out his dark hand. "Good evening, sir," he said. "You are the host. My soul's sight tells me so." "Good shot," Sir Charles answered. "These fellows have been quick-witted, you know. Mrs. Mackenzie, or they'd never get on. The seer gazed about him and smiled blankly at a person or two whose faces he seemed to recognize from a previous existence. Then Charles began to ask him a few simple questions, not about himself, but about me, just to test him. He answered most of them surprisingly correctly. His name begins with an S, I think. You will call him Seymour. He paused long with each clause, as if the facts were revealed to him slowly. "Seymour Wilbraham, Earl of Stafford." "No, not Earl of Stafford. Seymour Wilbraham Wentworth. There seems to be some connection in somebody's mind now present between Wentworth and Stafford. I am not English. I do not know what it means. But they are somehow the same name, Wentworth and Stafford." He gazed around apparently for confirmation. A lady came to his rescue. "Wentworth was the surname of the great Earl of Stafford," she murmured gently, "and I was wondering as you spoke whether Miss Wentworth might possibly have descended from him." "He is," the seer replied instantly, with a flash of those dark eyes. And I thought this curious, for though my father always maintained the reality of the relationship, there was one link wanting to complete the pedigree. He could not make sure that the Honorable Thomas Wilbraham Wentworth was the father of Jonathan Wentworth, the Bristol horse dealer from whom we were descended. "Where was I born?" Sir Charles interrupted, coming suddenly to his own case. The seer clapped his two hands to his forehead and held it between them, and as if to prevent it from bursting. "Africa," he said slowly, and the facts narrowed to him, so to speak. "South Africa, Cape of Good Hope, Johnsonville, Dewitt Street, 1840. "By Jove, he's correct," Sir Charles muttered. "He really seems to do it. Still, he may have found me out. He may have known where he was coming." "I never gave a hint," I answered. Till we reached the door. He didn't even know what hotel I was piloting him to. The seer stroked his chin softly. His eye appeared to have a furtive gleam in it. "Would you like to tell me the number of the bank note enclosed in an envelope?" he asked casually. "Go to the room," Sir Charles said. "I will pass it around the company." Signor Herrera disappeared. Sir Charles passed it around cautiously, holding it all the time in his own hand, but letting his guests see the number. Then he placed it in an envelope and gummed it down firmly. The seer returned. His keen eyes swept the company with a comprehensive glance. He shook his shaggy mane. Then he took the envelope in his hands and gazed at it fixedly. "AF 73549, he answered in a slow tone. "A Bank of England note for £50, exchanged at the casino for gold one yesterday at Monte Carlo." "I see how he did that," Sir Charles said triumphantly. "He must have changed it there himself, and then I changed it back again. In point of fact, I remember seeing the fellow with long hair loafing about. Still, it's capital conjuring." "He can see through matter," one of the ladies interposed. It was Madame Percadet. "He can see through a box." She drew a little gold vignette such as our grandmothers used, from her dress pocket. "What is in this?" she inquired, holding it up to him. Senor Herrera gazed through it. 3 gold coins, he replied, knitting his brows with the efforts of seeing into the box. 1, an American $5. 1, a French 10-franc piece. 1, 20 marks German, of the Emperor William. She opened the box and passed it around. Sir Charles smiled a quiet smile. "Confederacy," he muttered half to himself. "Confederacy." The seer turned to him with a sullen air. "You'll want to see a better sign," he said, in a very impressive voice. "A sign that will convince you. Very well. You have a letter in your left waistcoat pocket, a crumpled-up letter. Do you wish me to read it out loud? I will, if you desire it." It may seem to those who know Sir Charles incredible, but I am bound to admit my brother-in-law colored. What that letter contained, I cannot say. He only answered very testily and evasively, "No, thank you, I won't trouble you. The exhibition you've given us of your skill is quite more than amply suffices." And his fingers traced nervously to his waistcoat pocket, as if there was half afraid even then Senor Herrera could read it. I fancied, too, he glanced somewhat anxiously towards Madame Parkinson. The seer bowed courteously. "Your will, Senor, is law," he said. "I make it a principle, though. I can see through all things invariably to respect the secrecies and sanctities. If it were not so, I might dissolve society. For which of us is there who could not bear the whole truth being told about him?" He gazed around the room. An unpleasant thrill supervened. Most of us felt this uncanny Spanish-American knew really too much, and some of us were engaged in financial operations. For example, the seer continued bluntly, "I happened to see a few weeks ago a travel down here from Paris by train with a very important, intelligent man, a company promoter. He had in his bag some documents, some confidential documents." He glanced at Sir Charles. "You know what kind of thing, my dear sir. Reports of experts, of mining engineers. You may have seen such, marked strictly private." "They form an element of high finance," Sir Charles admitted coldly. "Precisely," the seer murmured, his accent for the moment less Spanish than before. "And, as they were marked strictly private, I respect, of course, the seal of confidence. That's all I wish to say. I hold it a duty, being trusted with such powers, not to use them in a manner which may annoy or incommode my fellow creatures." "Your feeling does you honor," Sir Charles answered with some acerbity. Then he whispered in my ear, "Confounded clever scoundrel, say. Rather wish we hadn't brought him here." Senor Herrera seemed intuitively to divine this wish, for he interposed in a lighter and gayer tone. "I will now show you a different and more interesting embodiment of occult power, for which she shall need a somewhat subdued arrangement of surrounding lights. Would you mind, Senor Host, for I have purposely abstained from reading your name on the brain of anyone present. Would you mind my turning down this lamp just a little? So, that will do. Now, this one and that one. Exactly, that's right." He poured a few grains of powder out of a packet into a saucer. "Next, a match if you please." "Thank you." It burnt with a strange green light. He drew from his pocket a card and produced a little ink bottle. "Have you a pen?" he asked. I instantly brought one. He handed it to Sir Charles. "Oblige me," he said, "by writing your name there." And he indicated a place on the center of the card, which had an embossed edge, with a small middle square of a different color. Sir Charles has a natural disinclination to signing his name without knowing why. "What do you want with it?" he asked. "A millionaire signature has so many uses." I want you to put the card in the envelope, the seer said, and then to burn it. After that, I shall show your own name written in the letters of blood on my arm, in your own handwriting. Sir Charles took the pen. If the signature was to be burned as soon as it finished, he didn't mind giving it. He wrote his name in his usual firm, clear style, the writing of a man who knows his worth and is not afraid of drawing a check for 5,000. Look at it long, the seer said from the other side of the room. He had not watched him write it. Sir Charles stared at it fixedly. The seer was really beginning to produce an impression. Now, put it in that envelope, the seer exclaimed. Sir Charles, like a lamb, placed it as directed. The seer strode up. Give me the envelope, he said. He took it in his hand, walked towards the fireplace, and solemnly burnt it. See, it crumbles into ashes, he cried. Then he came back to the middle of the room, close to the green light, rolled up his sleeve, and held his arm before Sir Charles. And there, in blood-red letters, my brother-in-law read his names. Charles Vandrift, in his own handwriting. I see how that's done, Sir Charles murmured, drawing back. It's a clever delusion, but still, I see through it. That's ghost book. Your ink was a deep green. Your light was green. You made me look at it long, and then I saw the name being written on your skin in the same arm in the complementary colors. You think so? The seer replied with a curious curl of the lip. I'm sure of it, Sir Charles answered. Quick as lightning, the seer again rolled up his sleeve. That's your name, he cried, in a very clear voice, but not your whole name. What do you say then to my right? And this also a complementary color. He held out his other arm. There, in sea green letters, I read the name Charles O'Sullivan Vandrift. It was my brother-in-law's full baptismal designation. But he has dropped the O'Sullivan for many years past, as to say the truth, he doesn't like it. He is a little bit ashamed of his mother's family. Charles glanced at it hurriedly. Quite right, he said. Quite right. But his voice was hollow. I could guess he didn't care to continue the seance. He could see through the man, of course, but it was clear the fellow knew too much about us to be entirely pleasant. Turn up the lights, I said, and turned to the servant. Shall I say coffee and Benedictine? I whispered to Vandrift. By all means, he answered. Anything to keep this fellow from further impertinences. And I say, don't you think you'd better suggest the same time that these men should smoke? Even the ladies are not above a cigarette, some of them. There was a sigh of relief. The lights burned brightly. The seer for a moment retired from business, so to speak, accepted a partega, and with a very good grace, sipped his coffee in a corner, and chatted to the lady who suggested Strafford with marked politeness. He was a polished gentleman. Next morning, in the hall of the hotel, I saw Madame Pickard again, in a neat tailor-made traveling dress, evidently bound for the railway station. What, off, Madame Pickard? I cried. She smiled and held out her pretty gloved hand. Yes, I'm off, she answered. Florence or Rome or somewhere. I've drained nice dry, like a sucked orange. Got all the fun I can out of it. Now I'll be away again to my lovely Italy. But it struck me as odd that, if Italy was her game, she went by ominous which takes down to the train de luxe for Paris. However, a man of the world accepts what a lady tells him, no matter how improbable. And I confess, for 10 days or so, I thought no more of her, or the seer either. At the end of that time, our fortnightly passbook came in for the Bank of London. It is a part of my duty, as the Millionaire secretary, to make up his book once a fortnight, and to compare the cancelled checks with Sir Charles's counterfoils. On this particular occasion, I happened to observe what I can only describe was a very grave discrepancy. In fact, the discrepancy was £5,000. On the wrong side, too. Sir Charles was debted with £5,000 more than the total amount of what was shown in the counterfoils. I examined the book with care. The source of the error was obvious. It lay as a cheque to sell from a bearer for £5,000, signed by Sir Charles, and evidently paid across the counter in London, as it bore on its face no stamp or indication of any other office. I called in my brother-in-law from the salon to the study. "Look here, Charles," I said. "There's a cheque in the book which you haven't entered." And I handed it to him without comment, for I thought it might have been drawn to settle some little loss on the turf or the cards, and to make up some other affair he didn't desire to mention to me. These things, will happen. He looked at it and stared hard. Then he pursed his mouth and gave a long, low whew. At last he turned it over and remarked, "I say, my boy, we've just done jolly well brown, haven't we?" I glanced at the cheque. "How do you mean?" I inquired. "Why, the Seer," he replied, still staring at it ruefully. "I don't mind the 5 thou, but to think a fellow should have gammoned a pair of us like that, ignominious, I dare say it." "How do you know it was a Seer?" I asked. "Look at the green ink," he answered. "Besides, I recollect the very shape of the last flourish. I flourished a bit like that in excitement at the moment, which I don't always do in my regular signature." "He's done us," I answered, recognizing it. "But how the dickens did he manage to transfer it to a cheque? This looks like your own handwriting, Charles, not a clever forgery." "It is," he said. "I admit it. I can't deny it. Only fancy this bamboozling me when I was the most on my guard. I can't be taken in by any silly occult tricks or catchwords. But it never occurred to me that he was doing to victimize me financially in this way. I expected attempts at a loan or an extortion. But to color my signature on a blank cheque? Atrocious." "How did he manage it?" I asked. "I haven't the faintest conception. I only know that these words I wrote. I could swear to them anywhere." "Then you can't protest the cheque?" "Unfortunately, no. It is my own true signature." We went that afternoon without delay to the chief commissary of police at the office. He was a gentlemanly Frenchman, much less formal and red-tapery than usual, and he spoke with an excellent English, with an American accent, having acted, in fact, as a detective in New York for about 10 years in his early manhood. "I guess," he said slowly after hearing our story, "you've been victimized right here by Colonel Clay, gentlemen." "Who is Colonel Clay?" Sir Charles asked. "That's just what I want to know," the commissary answered, in his curious American-French English. "He is a colonel because he occasionally gives himself a commission. He is called Colonel Clay because he appears to possess an india-rubbered face, and he could mold it like clay in the hands of a potter. Real name unknown. Nationality equally French and English. Address usually Europe. Profession former maker of wax figures in the Musée Grévin. Age what he chooses. He employs his knowledge to mold his own nose and cheeks with wax additions to the character he desires to impersonate. Aquiline this time, you say? Fine. Anything like these photographs?" He rummaged on his desk and handed us 2. "Not in the least," Sir Charles answered. "Except perhaps as to the neck. Anything here is quite unlike him." "Then that's the colonel," the commissary answered with decision, rubbing his hands in glee. "Look here." And he took out a pencil and rapidly sketched the outline of one of the 2 faces, that of a bland-looking young man with no expression worth mentioning. "There's the colonel in his simple disguise. Very good. Now watch me. Figure to yourself that he adds here a little patch of wax to the nose, an aquiline bridge, just so. Well, you have him right there. And the chin, one touch. Now for the hair, the wig, for complexion, nothing easier. That's the profile of your rascal, isn't it?" Exactly, we both murmured. By two curves of the pencil and the shock of false hair, the face was transmuted. He had very large eyes with big pupils, though, I objected, looking close. And the man in the photograph here has them small and real fishy. That's so, the commissary answered. A drop of belladonna expands and produces a seer. 5 grains of opium contract and give a dead alive, stupidly innocent appearance. Well, you leave this affair to me, gentlemen. I'll see the fun out. I don't say I'll catch him for you. Nobody has yet caught Colonel Clay. But I'll explain how he did the trick, and that ought to be consolation enough for a man of your means, for a trifle of 5,000. You are not a conventional French office holder, Master the Commissaire, I ventured to interpose. You bet, the commissary replied, and drew himself up like a captain of infantry. Monsieurs, he continued in French with the most dignity, I shall devote my resources to the office of tracing out the crime, and, if possible, to effectuating the arrest of the capable. We telegraphed to London, of course. We wrote to the bank with a full description of the suspected person, but I need hardly add that nothing came of it. 3 days later, the commissary called our hotel. Well, gentlemen, he said, I'm glad to say that I've discovered everything. What? Arrested the seer, Sir Charles said. The commissary drew back, almost horrified at the suggestion. Arrest Colonel Clay, he exclaimed. Monsieur, we are only human. Arrested him? No, not quite. But tracked out how he did it. That is already much. To unravel Colonel Clay, gentlemen. Well, what do you make of it? Sir Charles asked, crestfallen. The commissary sat down and gloated over his discovery. It was a clear, well-planned crime, amused him vastly. In the first place, monsieur, he said, disabuse your mind of the idea that when Monsieur, your secretary, went out to fetch Senor Herrera that night, Senor Herrera didn't know who those rooms he was coming. Quite otherwise, in point of fact. I do not doubt myself that Senor Herrera, or Colonel Clay, call him whichever you like, came to Nice in his winters for no other purpose than just to rob you. But I sent for him, my brother-in-law interposed. Yes, he meant you to send for him. He couldn't enforce the card, so to speak. If he couldn't do that, I guess he would be a pretty poor conjurer. He had a lady of his own, his wife, let's say, or his sister, stopping here at this hotel. A certain Madame Picardet. Through her, he induced several ladies in their circle to attend the seances. She and they spoke to you about him, and aroused your curiosity. You may bet your bottom dollar that when he came to this room, he already primed and prepared with endless facts about the both of you. What fools we've been, say, my brother-in-law exclaimed. I see it all now. That designing woman sent around before dinner to say I wanted to meet him. And by that time you got there, he was already bamboozling me. That's so, the commissary answered. He had your name already painted on both his arms, and he had made other preparations of still greater importance. You mean the check? Well, how did he get it? The commissary opened the door. Come in, he said. A young man entered, whom we recognized at once as the chief clerk for the foreign department of Crédit Marseille, the principal bank of all along the Riviera. State what you know of this check, the commissary said, showing it to him, for we had handed it over to the police as a piece of evidence. About 4 weeks ago, the clerk began. Say, 10 days before your séance, the commissary interposed. A gentleman with very long, dark, and awkwardly nosed, dark, strange, and handsome, called in at my department and asked if I could tell him the name of Sir Charles Vandrift, London banker. He had said he had a sum to pay in your credits, and asked if we would forward it to him. I told him it was irregular for us to receive the money, as you had no account with us, but that your lord bankers were Darby, Drummond, and Rothenberg, Limited. Quite right, Sir Charles murmured. 2 days later, a lady, Madame Picardet, who was a customer of ours, brought in a good cheque for £3,000, signed by the first-rate name, and asked us to pay it in debt to Darby, Drummond and Rothmans, and to open a London account with them for her. We did so, and received a reply checkbook, from which this cheque was taken, as I learned from the number, by telegram of London, the commissary put in. Also, that was the same day on which your cheque was cashed. Madame Pickardette in London withdrew her balance. How did you get the fellow to sign the cheque? Charles answered. How did he manage the card trick? The commissary produced a similar card from his pocket. Was that the sort of thing? He asked. Precisely, a facsimile. I thought so. Well, our colonel, I find, bought a packet of such cards, intended for admission to a religious function at the shop in Pia Messina. He cut out to the center, and see here. The commissary turned it over and showed a piece of paper pasted neatly over the back. This he tore off, and there, concealed behind it, lay a folded check, with only the place where the signature should be written showing through the face which the seer had presented to us. I call that a neat trick, the commissary remarked, with professional enjoyment of a really good deception. But he burnt the envelope before my eyes, Sir Charles exclaimed. Pooh, the commissioner answered. What would he be worth as a conjurer anyway, if he couldn't substitute one envelope for another between the table and the fireplace without your noticing it? And Colonel Clay, you remember, is a prince among conjurers. Well, it's a comfort to know we've been identified our man and woman who was with him, Charles said, with a slight sigh of relief. The next thing will be, of course, you'll follow him up on the clues in England and arrest him. The commissary shrugged his shoulders. Arrest them? He exclaimed, much amused. Oh, monsieur, but you are sanguine. No officer of justice has ever succeeded in arresting the Colonel Cacloche, as we call him in French. He is as slippery as an eel, that man. He wriggles through our fingers. Suppose even we caught him. What could we prove, I ask you? Nobody who has seen him once can ever swear to see him again in his next impersonation. He is impayable, this good colonel. On this day, when I arrest him, I assure you, monsieur, I shall consider myself the smartest police officer in Europe. Well, I shall catch him yet, Sir Charles answered, and relapsed into silence.